Can I welcome members of the committee and members of the public, both here and watching on the webcast, to today's meeting of the Confirmation Hearings Committee. Our main item of today is to conduct a confirmation hearing for the office of Chair of the London Pensions Fund Authority. But first we have a few short items of formal business to go through before we start. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to a silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions this afternoon. Can I start by asking our clerk, Teresa Young, if any apologies have been received for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. There have been apologies from Assembly Member Arnold, and Assembly Member Cooper is attending as a substitute for her today. Also, Assembly Member Duval and Assembly Member Gavron is attending as a substitute for him. And finally, Assembly Member O'Connell has given apologies, and Assembly Member Hall will be substituting for him. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Can I ask, on item 2, can I ask the committee to note the committee's terms of reference and membership as agreed at the annual meeting of the London Assembly at its meeting on the 2nd of May 2019?
Noted.
Thank you. Third item, declarations of interest. Can I ask Assembly members to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interest and other relevant interests, including any declarations in relation to gifts and hospitality, which are not reflected on the authority's Register of Gifts and Hospitality, where they relate to the items on the agenda for today's meeting?
No.
There being none, can I therefore welcome John Preston to the meeting and ask you if you got any interest to declare which are relevant to the business of this meeting or in relation to your proposed appointment to the office of Chair of the London Pensions Fund Authority? Thank you. So item 4, we can now move on to the main business of the meeting. At this confirmation hearing, the committee will be putting questions to you in relation to your proposed appointment of you to the office of Chair of the London Pensions Fund Authority. Before moving to the question and answer session, can I ask the committee to formally note the background information appendices 1 to 3 that have been circulated with the agenda for the meeting? And noted? Can I ask you to note the supplementary information received after publication of the agenda, and that is John Preston's supporting statement, a CV, and a summary of the role and responsibilities of the Office of the Chair of the London Pensions Fund Authority, and a summary of key issues and priorities for the London Pensions Fund Authority for London.
Noted.
Now let's move over to question and answers. Members will now ask you questions, Mr. Preston. So what do you, but after me, that's my prerogative as chair, I can ask the first one. So what do you see as the challenges and opportunities of the role of the chair of the London Pensions Fund Authority, and what value would you bring to the role in that context?
I suppose there's a number of areas that I'd like to pick on, and I'll try to be as brief as I can. Clearly, as I say in my personal statement, the overriding responsibility is to make sure that the pensioners receive the money that they're entitled to and which they deserve. As part of that process, we need to make sure that the fund has the resources it needs. That obviously requires working with LPP to make sure that the investments are going to deliver what we need. It also involves making sure that the administration of the fund via LPP and our partners is properly done. But there are a number of other challenges which the Mayor highlights in some of his guidance notes for the LPFA, looking at our policy on responsible investment, looking at the way in which we collaborate and work with other pension funds, and if we can find ways of improving greater efficiency, greater economies of scale to at least minimise the potential impact on the employers and therefore ultimately the taxpayer. There is something about the LPFA, simply because it is the LPFA, having a role to play in both LGPS within the UK and with similar funds outside the UK, and the board of the LPFA, and therefore the chair of that board, clearly has to make sure that he utilises the responsibility that that brings with it properly and appropriately. That's sort of a list of the things. In terms of what I think I can bring to that, I believe that the experience I've had both within managing large pension funds and more broadly, together with the experience I've gained of trying to work collaboratively with a wide range of different stakeholders, will put me in a position to try and make sure that those objectives can be met, and that I'll be able to help and guide both the board and the other key stakeholders in delivering those objectives.
You mentioned a requirement for those investments to reflect a certain base of ethical and responsible investments. How do you balance those objectives of maximising the benefit to pensioners, but also keeping socially responsible?
It's often portrayed as if those two objectives are sort of a million miles apart. Actually, I'm not convinced they are a million miles apart. I mean, if you take fossil fuel companies, for example, which is obviously, you know, one of the most significant issues coming out of responsible investment. I mean, if it's the case, as it almost always is, that a significant part of the value of a fossil fuel company is based around the reserves that they still have in the ground, if they're not actually going to be able to get those reserves out of the ground economically because of changes in demand or changes in regulation or so forth, then that company may well not be worth what the market is currently valuing it at. Similarly, you can say the same thing about tobacco companies and a number of other areas where if you look very carefully at what the long-term value issues are, then you can see that this key objective of making sure that this key objective of making sure that we keep the financial responsibility to deliver the returns that we need to pay our pensions and the need to manage responsible investment are really not that far apart.
Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you. Yes, just on that point about the sort of ethically responsible investment, and I do agree with you that this posing of maximising benefits versus being socially responsible can sometimes be a bit of a false opposition. I wondered if you could tell us a bit more, because although you refer to further developing the approach to environment, social and governance issues, ESG, I'd like to unpack a bit more what your view is around both divestment, and that's something that the Mayor pledged in 2016 in his manifesto, and there's been a route of divesting from fossil intensive investments. But also I'd like to hear a bit more separately from divestment about how you could see the fund being used in terms of positive investment. Now, you do mention social housing, but I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more about whether you think there's anything there around renewables and low carbon, so both the divestment but the investment into those very forward-thinking areas.
Yes, very happy to pick up on that. I suppose two questions there, if I may. So, in terms of divestment, I mean, obviously, I'm coming to this new, so I can't speak to the detail. I'm aware that the LPP, working with the LPFA, has made very substantial divestments, and we're only now down to a very small percentage. That is something I know that the board is continuing to look at with a view to continuing to manage that process. I understand that, as is often the case, it's not as easy just to sort of sell these things depending upon the nature of the investments, but it is something that we will continue to look at as part of the ongoing development of the policy.
That's not something you'd resile from as the chair, then? That's very much something you would be wanting to see continue?
Absolutely.
Perhaps go even a little faster?
It is. I'm sorry, say again?
Perhaps even go a little faster?
Well, as I say, I'm not trying to duck the question. I can't speak to the detail of it because I don't know the detail, but the principle of it, I think, is very clear, that we are looking to try and see if we can implement a policy of responsible investment on all areas, as I say, not just fossil fuels, but everything. In terms of the positives, which I agree is a much more optimistic way of thinking about things, one of the really valuable things about an open pension fund, as opposed to most of the ones in the sort of private sector which are now closed, is that we really do have a long-term view and can take a long-term view. The starting point for evaluating any investment has to be that it's a proper investment. I mean, we can't, we have that responsibility to our members, and therefore we can't invest in things which aren't going to produce proper returns, which carry too much risk and so forth. But subject to that, then I think we do have an opportunity, and indeed to some extent a responsibility, to think about whether there are investments that can be made which are consistent with our investment objectives, but also happen to benefit the people of London. And if we can do that, or even more widely, and if we can do that, then that would be terrific. And it's something I think we ought to be looking at.
Because there has long been a discussion about the use of pension funds in that sort of responsible and forward-thinking way. But I think most of the people who've entered into that discussion have then not really gone much beyond that as a slogan, if you like. And I just wondered if that was an area that you'd had any previous experience of implementing. I completely agree with you. It still has to be, within the context of a proper ROI, because you can't have maladministration of the benefits for the pensioners and the forthcoming pensioners. Is that something that you've seen through before elsewhere? Because obviously you've got a track record here.
Without minimising it, it's actually harder in the private sector than it is in the public sector, because so many private sector funds are now closed, and actually they're becoming really very mature. So when one starts thinking about sort of knee-jerk, these are long-term investments, actually an awful lot of these funds don't have anything like the same length of time horizon, and they're now getting to the stage where they're sort of more cash flow negative, and therefore they have the need for being able to have access to the cash, and they can't have quite so many illiquid investments as necessarily one immediately thinks. As I say, one of the advantages of a fund both of this size and the fact that it continues to be open means that we do have a longer term horizon. So I think we have an opportunity to look at these things more than perhaps some of the other private sector funds do.
So it would be something that you would be looking to develop?
Yes, subject, as I say, to the constraint that these have to be proper investments, and there has to be a balance of the nature of the investments that we make.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. I just want to pick up on a couple of bits in your personal statement, which actually follows on neatly from what Leonie's been talking about. You say, of course, climate change is one of the factors that you have to consider. But lower down, you talk about to continue the work of investing in economically strong infrastructure projects. Now, I can imagine one or two economically strong infrastructure projects in London that actually conflict with concerns about climate change. The Heathrow third runway, for instance, would be a very strong example of that. And I just wondered if you could say a bit about that kind of tension between big infrastructure projects that might have a financial case for them, but that actually also has a conflict with a desire to reduce carbon emissions. Yeah, I suppose. I hope I'm not being oversimplistic. I'm not sure I see a huge conflict, in the sense that the policy has to be that you are investing responsibly, and at the same time, whilst you're investing responsibly, you need to invest in things that are financially secure. So I wouldn't start from a perspective, if this is your question, of saying, well, as long as it produces a return, anything is okay. You start from the perspective of saying, we have a policy on responsible investment. Is the investment that we're looking at part of that policy of responsible investment? Once you're within that, you then say, is this something that makes economic sense and doesn't carry too high a risk? So I wouldn't see those two things in conflict, if you see what I mean. Okay. Does that help? Yes, that does help. Thank you. Thank you very much. And then just picking up on ethical investment, there was in late 2018, it was revealed that although the LPFA doesn't have any direct investments in arms manufacturing, it did have a total of about 40 million indirectly invested in arms companies, which produced a dividend income of about 2.4 million. Would you be looking to divest the fund from investments indirect investments in arms manufacturing?
I hate to sound like I'm ducking a question. I feel I probably can't speak too much about specific issues like that because I don't know the circumstances in the background. But I do think, as I say, that the starting point has to be to continue the work, the great work I think that's been done on developing a policy on responsible investment and making sure that once we've got an agreed policy on responsible investment, that our investments are compliant with that. I would be very surprised if, well, I'm quite certain that any discussion on responsible investment would include examination of that sort of thing. I can't sort of give a commitment on it because I don't know the background, but the principle of it I think is perfectly reasonable.
Yep, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Gavron.
Yes. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Just to follow up from the theme about divestment, the asset managers I've spoken to always explain to me how difficult it is to track what's happening in portfolios, collections of shares which are put together, or investments that are put together for shareholders. And I just wonder if you've got any experience of that, because although the Pension Authority, we've done very, very well in terms of divesting during this administration, I'm not sure how far we've been able to track what's going on in our portfolio holdings.
Well,
you've probably got experience of this from all your previous experience.
Thank you. Yes, clearly, one of the difficulties is it depends upon the nature of the funds in which you invest. So, stating the obvious, if you invest in a fund and that fund simply invests in the FTSE 100, then it's very difficult to say, well, we're not going to invest in individual funds within that FTSE 100. You have to build a more bespoke fund which is capable of choosing which funds you're going to invest in. So it is difficult to track. There's two ways in which you can deal with it. One, you have to be very careful about the fund you invest in the first place. And obviously that's easier to do going forward than it is historically. The second thing which is making a massive difference is, for the reasons of which you'll be aware, partly political pressure from the regulator and so forth, there's much greater pressure on fund managers in the process they adopt in looking at both overall fund managers for themselves and then the individual assets within their portfolio to take full account of ESG factors in picking the assets in the first place. So the easiest way of doing it is to make sure that the managers take the right information into account in choosing the assets so that you don't have to try and track them after the event. They don't get into the portfolio in the first place.
I see.
I don't want to pretend that's an easy process, but it is part of the way in which this thought process is changing.
So that's something that you would want to guide the authority on?
Well, it goes further than that. I think actually there's almost an obligation now.
An obligation?
To, I mean, one of the things that all pension funds have to do now is actually make a statement about what instructions they give their fund managers about taking ESG factors into account and how they do that.
Oh, good.
That's a slight simplification, but the principle of it. So this is becoming more mainstream within the pension fund area anyway. So it's never going to be easy, but it's becoming easier to do as we go forward.
Thank you for that answer. I found that really informative. Now, you're a 50-50 organisation. I always remember being told you actually have to have 51%, but never mind, 50-50. So if you're 50-50, how can you guarantee that your partner organisation, Lancashire County Council, are going to be agreeing?
I wish I had a perfect answer to that question. I mean, my experience of working with genuine joint ventures 50-50 is that it comes down to honest and open engagement between the partners. I mean, at the end of the day, I would hope that Lancashire, our partner Lancashire County Council, and we have broadly similar objectives. We clearly have the same objective in terms of wanting to make sure that we do the best thing for our members. I would hope that by careful and honest engagement, trying to build trust, trying to be open in the way in which we communicate with each other, that we will be able to identify any potential problems very early on and therefore work to resolve them. Can I guarantee that we will never disagree? No, but I would hope that by the right process you minimise the chances and the likelihood of that ever happening.
Do you think there might be a role there for the political leaders in that?
Well, I'm sitting in front of a group of politicians. I'm never going to say no to that process. I think inevitably Lancashire County Council has a slightly different structure to that, as I understand it. The person that I would engage with most openly there is the leader of their council, so almost by definition there is a political process. I can certainly say that in approaching this role, whilst it is important that the LPFA maintains its independence, to try and do this without taking advantage of the resources, experience and expertise both of the London Assembly, the Mayor's Office and so forth would be crazy. So I would certainly hope that I'll have the ability to engage and find out what people are thinking, and if there's a role to be played, then I'm not going to be precious about asking people for help.
Interesting, because you will be dealing with two very different kinds of authority.
Yes.
One county council and one a strategic authority.
Very much so.
How much, can you just, how much experience have you got of working with local government in its various guises?
I freely admit, I have comparatively little experience of working directly with local government. I would merely observe, and I hope this is fair, that although that I haven't had that direct experience, I spent quite a lot of time working in environments where the needs and requirements of politicians in general are important, and I'm very sensitive to that sort of issue. I hope the nature of the roles I've done over the years has helped me to develop, with a small p, quite strong political antennae, and therefore I'm very sensitive to the needs to make sure that, you know, the way in which, so I think I understand the way in which politicians see the world and think about the world, both nationally and locally, and they're very sensitive to try and make sure that you never surprise them, you never embarrass them, you always try and make sure you consult in advance. And my whole leadership style, if that isn't too grandiose, is very much one of consensus, to try and make sure that I bring people with me, and if that means that you have to spend a little bit more time talking to people in advance, then that's what you have to do.
Sometimes leads not to the highest common factor, but the lowest common denominator.
Yes, I mean sometimes clearly that's true. I hope that in
I'm just playing devil's advocate now.
Yeah,
I believe in consensus, but
I hope that in practice the independent nature of what it is we're trying to do, and the recognition that actually we have an objective which everybody agrees with, which is to make sure that our members get paid, will mean that you won't get down to that sort of lowest common denominator level. But you have to take each case on its merit.
thank you.
Any other members? Can I just ask, you talked about your the way in which you conduct your business and being very open. Can we expect to hear from you before we appoint the next chair of the London Pensions Fund Authority? Do you think that's something that you might engage with, you know, that you may engage with us on a regular basis?
I mean, yes is the short answer. I mean, I'm very happy to engage as, you know, frequently and as appropriately as possible. I mean, I confess I'm hoping you're not going to ask me to come and talk to you every week, but
no,
I can't imagine you'd want me to do that. But
we probably wouldn't invite you every week, but yes.
But I go back to what I said a minute ago, that, as I say, particularly since I'm conscious I'm new to this, to try and do this role without drawing upon the expertise and the resources of the people in this room, the people in the Mayor's office and so forth, I think would be crazy. So, you know, both collectively and individually, I would hope that I would be able to engage and find out what people are thinking and how things are working. I mean, I will have a process of making sure that I gather feedback on my performance from a range of stakeholders. Doesn't mean to say that we will always agree with each other. That I can't promise. I can promise I'll always try and listen.
Yes. Of course, we're on the London Assembly. We always agree with each other.
Of course.
All the time.
All the time.
And so, if there are no other questions, can I thank you, Mr. Preston, for attending today and for answering our questions. You're welcome to leave, but you're also welcome to observe our further deliberations from the public gallery if you so choose. Thank you so much indeed for your time. All the time.
Lancashire County Council.
Just wait till Louise comes back.
I don't know. No, we've got 50-50. I said, I always think we should have 51%.
Thank you very much for that. The committee is now required to make a decision on its recommendation to the Mayor as to whether or not the nominee should be appointed to the office of Chair of the London Pensions Fund Authority. I am willing to propose from the Chair that it be agreed that the Mayor should proceed with the appointment of John Preston to the office of the Chair of the London Pensions Authority. Is that proposal seconded?
Happy to second that, Chair.
And now, can I see the agreement of the committee?
I want to say that I think it should be this last point. I mean, here's a chairman who wants to actually engage with the politicians, and I think you were hinting at that too, but
Yeah.
I think it should be subject to some report backs and face-to-face.
Okay. Technically speaking, we kind of took the vote.
Oh, did we?
Yeah.
Yes. But I'm happy to include that we include in the letter
A sentence in the letter.
that's something that we would welcome in future.
Chair, could we perhaps welcome the way that engagement was talked about
More
during
than
the
happy
session?
to include that reference in the letter, of course.
Yeah.
That being said, so thank you. Sorry, you've just got in the mic for a second. Difference. Thank you, everyone. A letter will be sent to the Mayor following this meeting to confirm this committee's recommendation. I'll just move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the
We don't have a meeting scheduled.
right
Chair.
date of the next meeting. There is none. So any other business the Chair considers urgent, I haven't got any. So thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you.